Hi everyone, and welcome to part 2 of my lecture on chapter 16 on process costing. In part 1, we just went over kind of the basic characteristics of process costing and how costs are tracked on a very general basis and how it's different than job order costing. So then once you understand kind of the basic concept of process costing, now we're going to actually get into the steps. And like I said, we're not going to go over every single step. We're just going to go over step 1 and 2. And I'm going to do them just very basically because if you understand the basic concepts before coming into class, then when we're in class and we start building on that and giving you some more complex examples, you'll be able to follow along. It'll make more sense because you understand the simple example and then you can understand the more complex example. Okay, so first let's talk about the physical flow of units. And I put here inputs equals outputs. I'll explain what that means momentarily. But the physical flow of units basically just means reconciling to show that what went into production is also what went out of production, that those things equal. Now, I'm presenting this to you as a T account or a ledger, but note that it's in units. Now, normally when we see ledgers, it has to do with dollars, right? Because it's accounting and we account for things in dollars. And eventually we will be doing this same thing, but in dollars. But the same concept can be applied with units. It's actually simpler when you think about it in terms of units. It'll get a little more complex when we add the dollars to it. But if you can get it in units first, it's going to make the next part easier, okay? So the first step is just calculating the physical flow of units. Again, the WIP account is set up the same way. It's an inventory account. So things that add to that account will be on the debit side. Things that take away from that account are going to be on the credit side. Okay. So the things in your work in process account that were input into the production process is your beginning work in process. So that's the stuff that we started last month but haven't finished yet. So that becomes our beginning work in process. And in this case, we're saying there were 50 units that we started last month that we didn't finish. So that's our beginning work in process. Well, that becomes our first input for the current month. Okay, we're gonna presumably finish these units first. Okay. Then we're going to start some additional units. And in this case, we're saying we started 100 additional units. Okay? So the total units that were input into the production process are what you started but haven't finished, but you're going to finish it this month, as well as the additional units that you started. So these two together are what you can call your inputs, and if you add them together, that is 150 units. So you had 150 units or 150 pens in production during the current month. Okay? Now, one of two things could have happened to those pens. Either you finished them, in which case they come out of this WIP account and move on to the next, or you didn't finish them, and then they are still in your ending work in process. Does this pattern sound familiar? I know we've been talking about it for a while since boot camp, talked about it again in chapter 14, again in chapter 15, but that same concept applies, right? We start with what was unfinished before, add in some additional stuff. That's everything that was in production. And then one of two things happened. Either we finished or we didn't. Okay? And those two things are your outputs. What you completed and transferred on came out of the process, but the other thing that came out of the process is the stuff that you didn't finish. Okay, and that's your ending work in process. So these two things are considered your outputs, the two things that came out of production at the end of the month, either the ones we finished or the ones that we didn't finish, okay? And so when you add those two together, those are your outputs, and what do you know? If we finished 125 units, that means 25 were unfinished. So therefore your outputs also equal 150 units. Got it? So inputs equal outputs. Okay? That's our physical flow of units. We've confirmed that what went into production also came out in one way, shape, or form. The question, though, arises with how do we value these unfinished items? Okay, so the ink cartridges, there must be a value attached to these unfinished ink cartridges. There must also be a value attached to the casings. Okay, so this was step 1 and this was step 2. There's a value there. How do we value it? Okay, that's where the concept of equivalent units of production come in. And that's a concept that we use to help measure the value of partially completed goods. Okay, and that is step 2 in the process, to calculate the number of equivalent units. So, I'm going to give you a really simple example here. Again, I want to start with simple and I want you to understand the simple concept, so then when I say equivalent units of production in class, you'll be like, oh yeah, I remember the water pitcher example, okay? And then it'll make the more complex work that we do in class and in your homework, it's going to make more sense to you. So, equivalent units of production expresses a number of partially completed units as a smaller number of fully completed units. Okay? The formula to calculate that is the number of unfinished units times the percent they are completed. And that gives you your equivalent unit of production. So here's, again, a very simple example. If you have 2 pitchers of water that are each half full, your number of units is 2, right? 2 pitchers. The percent complete is 50% because they're each 50% full. So if you multiply 2 times 50%, you get 1. Okay? And what that says is that 2 half-full pitchers is equivalent to 1 full pitcher. Okay? Hopefully this makes sense. But that's what we mean by equivalent units of production. We're saying, look, there's a number of partially completed units, in this case 2 partially completed units, but they're equal to 1 fully completed unit. Okay? Now, it does get a little more complex than this, and here's the reason why. As goods go through the production process, right, each of the different departments in the process, right, the ink department, the casing department, and the packaging department, the materials and labor go in at different rates, okay? So it takes, if there's like all the materials that it takes to make this final product of packaged pens, all the materials is 100%. Okay, but the materials as they go through the process go in at different phases. So for example, let's say 50% of the direct materials go in with the ink department. 40% of the direct materials go into the casing department, and then 10% of the direct materials go into the packaging department. Okay, you add all that up, it's the full 100% of materials, but it's gone in at different phases. So we use these percentages when we're calculating equivalent units of production, right? Because if it's in phase 1, we're going to say it's 50% complete with direct materials. So that's going to be we take the number of units times the percent complete, we'd use this 50%. But if you notice here, labor went in at a different rate, okay? We're saying of all the work it takes to make these pens, 30% of the work happens in the ink department, 50% of the work happens in the casing department, and 20% of the work goes into the packaging department. Okay, so direct materials and direct labor don't always go in at the same rate. They go in at different rates, okay? Because some parts in the process require more materials and some parts in the process require more labor, just kind of the way it goes. So you might be asking now, what about factory overhead? And that's a great question. So, in process costing, rather than just tracking direct labor alone, we track direct labor and factory overhead at the same time, and we call these two things together conversion costs. And that says we assume that factory overhead enters the production process at the same rate as direct labor. Okay, because you can't really time how much. Again, we talked about how overhead is just so difficult to measure in the first place. You can't really measure how much goes in at each process, right? How much utilities does the packaging department use? How much utilities does the ink department use? You can't really break it down like that. The whole factory is using this utilities. So instead, we make an assumption that factory overhead enters the production process at the same rate as direct labor. And to kind of give you an idea of what that means, we're going to say, look, here's this guy operating the machine. He's our direct labor. Well, as he's operating the machine, also there's going to be the machine depreciation and the utilities, the electricity on the machine. So you kind of see there's a correlation. It may not be completely 100% accurate correlation, but there is a correlation there that as the guy is operating the machine, also we're incurring overhead costs related to the use of the machine. So we just assume that they go in at the same rate. So conversion costs is direct labor and factory overhead together. Okay. So I kind of just revised this a little bit to show, okay, direct materials again are going in 50%, 40%, 10%, but now we're going to say, instead of just direct labor, we're going to say conversion costs go in at 30%, 50%, and 20%, because again, we assume that direct labor and conversion costs are going to go in at the same rate. And so again, to remind you, our formula for calculating equivalent units of production is the number of units times the percent complete. That equals your equivalent units of production. So therefore, we must calculate a separate equivalent units of production for direct materials and conversion costs, because the percent complete is different for each one. So if it's in process one, we'll say it's 50% complete with respect to direct materials, but only 30% complete with respect to conversion costs. Okay? Now again, I don't expect you to have that totally 100% understood. You can do a tough problem. That's not what I'm looking for here. I just want you to be familiar with the concept, to know that these things go in at different rates, to know that we combine direct labor and overhead at the same rate. We call them conversion costs. So again, if you can understand these basic terms and concepts, it's going to make our time in class that much easier. So hopefully these videos were helpful in helping you understand these concepts. Again, you can take a look at the reading guide and read up about them again if there were any areas that didn't make sense. And of course, if you have any questions, shoot me an email, or be sure to bring your questions to class so we can make sure to get them answered so that you fully understand this stuff. All right, see you guys.